Hello and welcome to part 2 for how to paint this Stormcast Eternal from the Dominion box set which Games Workshop sent me. So this video I'm going to carry straight on from the previous video, starting with the shoulder pads, and they're going to be painted blue to match the artwork that came with the box. And so I'm using Kantor blue. It's quite a nice blue. It's sort of a little bit desaturated, so it's a bit darker. It's got some black mixed in with it basically. Because I didn't want too much of a really strong saturation for it. It kind of like matches the look of the rest of the model. If you look on the wet palette there in the top left hand side, you'll see there's quite a few blues I've got, but they're all it's all the same colour. I've just added white to it gradually each time, so it's you know, for the first one straight. Right, so top right is Kantor blue straight from the pot, mixed with a bit of water. And below that it's just a small amount of white, obviously to the left of that, a bit more white. Probably around about 50-50 at that point, and above that it's majority white, and then on the far left obviously it's just plain white. I've been using P3 Morrow White for mine. You don't have to use P3 Morrow White. You know, any white will do. It's just my preferred one. You know, I find it a little bit smoother to work with, but you know, there's not going to be a vast difference between most of the whites that you use. And then at the bottom I've got some Vallejo model colour black, and I use that more like a rubber really. You know, so if I make any mistakes, I can just go over it with the black because it matches the black primer really well. So it's really kind of, you know, handy just to have some black paint on my palette all the time, really, you know, to correct mistakes or for shading, things like that. So if you look at how I've applied the paint so far, it's very similar in technique to how I apply the gold. But the main thing that's going to be different is obviously the end result. So if you wanted, you could paint this to have the same properties, so the same kind of shiny look as the non-metallic gold. You know, obviously just a different colour. So you still have like the bounce lights and, you know, the strong light volumes. But I'm changing this because I don't want the look to. I don't want it to look like the same kind of material. So the non-metallic gold I want to look like a metallic surface, and the shoulder pads. I don't know, I guess painted or sort of, you know, something different anyway, just to make them to make the model more interesting, really. You can see that I've already painted the shoulder pad on the right hand side, so I mean you can still see the sort of like little scratchy kind of marks. They are a little bit neater than the scratchy marks on the gold, because one thing about non-metallic metals when you paint them is you can actually be a bit rough. And don't forget this is quite a zoomed in video, so you know they look rough, you know, when the screen's massive and zoomed in, but when you hold it in your hand they're still very tiny and it looks still neat enough. But having these kind of little distorted edges and things helps to give the impression that it's a metallic surface with just lots of imperfections all over it. Whereas you can see for the blue that I'm doing, so I'm still using just the tip of the brush. And you do need to water the paints down again, because as I mentioned in the previous video, if you use thicker paint and you just use the tip of the brush all the time, the friction is going to cause the tip to wear down quite rapidly. But in this case, so it's watered down around about 1.5 parts water to 1 part paint, and it's just kind of like doing all these little squiggles, you know, layering up over and over. So you will find as well that Kantor blue is quite a translucent paint, so you know, when you make the marks, they're going to be quite subtle anyway. And also because I've got all these different steps in the highlights, it means that the transitions are going to be much smoother anyway, just because it's a lower contrast between each stage. Whereas if you compare that to the non-metallic gold, when I was doing that, I was jumping quite big stages between the midtones and the highlights, because again I'm thinking of the light volumes and, you know, that there's really strong high contrast highlights to make the non-metallic gold work. But for light placement, it's still exactly the same process really. So if you hold it under a lamp, you can see roughly where the light falls on the model, and then you adapt the highlights from there. Now in this case, because I'm classing the shoulder pads as being painted, I can actually use the light reference and the light volumes that that I can see when I hold the model under a lamp. So in that case, I can, you know, copy them exactly. It makes life a lot easier. So, you know, all you got to do is just, you know, make sure that the light highlight is, you know, as close as you you can get, but without spending an eternity doing it. Remember, this is kind of like a sort of a very, very high tabletop standard, I guess you would say. Probably you would reserve this more for, the characters and things like that. He's the leader of the squad, so I guess it's worth spending a bit of time on him. But I wouldn't spend this amount of time on one of the kind of like the base models for the army. But I think it's pretty straightforward. You can see what I'm doing with the layering up. Because of the nice translucency of the colours, you can go backwards and forwards very easily, and there'll be very subtle changes in highlights and shadows. And what I mean by that really is that because the highlights are so close to each other, you can dip the paint quickly, you brush quickly in one of the lighter or darker colours right next to the colour that you've been painting, and it'll just blend in really, really quickly. And the translucency means you can go over it slightly, and because of the translucency means you can see the paint underneath it. It'll just like affect the colour slightly, so it all blends together much more smoothly. So eventually you'll have quite quickly a very nice smooth looking finish, but it'll just have, if you're doing this technique with the kind of the squiggly marks, it'll have a very subtle texture on it. Now again, because it's zoomed in, you can see the texture more clearly, but it's just something that it's actually quite hard to see on the model when you're holding it in your hand. And especially like if you put it on the tabletop, you're not going to see that at all. It'll actually look just like a smooth transition. Now, of course, if you wanted to get a really smooth transition and do it a lot quicker, you could just airbrush it. You would have to mask off what you've already painted, obviously. Or you could do it the other way around and quickly airbrush some blue on to start with and then paint over the other areas. But that means you wouldn't be able to airbrush the gold to start with either. So either way you can do it. You either have to mask areas and airbrush, or just do it all by hand like I've done. And then here again on the trim. So the biggest difference, as I said, so you saw how I painted on the previous video, so how I painted the back of this shoulder pad here, and there was the bounce highlight at the bottom. Now I'm not having this material be quite as shiny or reflective, so I'm not painting any bounce highlights up from the trim onto the lower part of the shoulder. It's not too bad if you do, like, I guess with how I painted it, for that level of brightness, there would be some bounce highlights. It might look a little bit better if you do like a very soft bounce highlight down there, but I just left it plain. I guess I'm being lazy. You could do that, like I said, and it would look quite good, but just don't take it as bright as the highlights on the metal. So in the previous video I also mentioned this kind of technique is very much like stippling, but it's a lot quicker, and it looks a little bit more erratic. It's a different texture effect. So if some people paint models entirely using stippling, I think that takes a long time, but it gives a very nice clean finish. But you can do variations in texture on surfaces and things. So sometimes you can have very smooth parts on the model. You can have stippled areas on a model. Stippling's really nice to do for kind of like cloth materials. And it's a nice thing on a model if you can vary all the surfaces on there, so you get like different textures and different subtleties. So sometimes it's fun to have very smooth, clean areas, but it's kind of boring to paint the whole model in that way. Or you can do the whole model in stippling, but it takes a long time, and unless you really like stippling, it can be boring to do the whole model again. So, but if you do all these different techniques and different surface styles all over the model, then you probably find it more interesting for the painting, just because you're changing it up all the time. You can see his hands come off there. Obviously it's not glued on, but I do find it quite handy excuse the pun, to have the shield there on the model, just for working out the light placement. So in the previous video you saw how I did the non-metallic gold on the armor. I didn't show you how to do the shield because basically it's just the same as painting on the armor. But when I painted the shield, I did kind of blue tack it to the base of the model, just so I can kind of balance the placement for the highlights. So there are the blue shoulder pads completed. Now I'm going to show you how to do a non-metallic effect for his kind of chain loincloth kind of thing. I don't know what the correct name for it is, but regardless, it's a very quick and easy thing to do on this. Now on the artwork for this, this looks like a different material. It looks like cloth, but it very clearly isn't cloth on the model. It's sculpted quite, it looks like scale armor. So that's how I'm painting it. I was almost tempted to paint it in sort of like the greeny colours that the artwork suggests, but I just felt that the sculpting on it was just too clearly indicative of it being a metal surface. So, and also I think with the finished area, with the way that I highlight this, it does stand out nicely because it goes dark either side of it, so it works quite nicely just to just catches the eye in a dark area. Now, part of the way that I do that is I focus the highlights more on the top section, which matches, if you look on the thigh plates either side, see they're brighter at the top and they get darker at the bottom. So for this groin cover area, I'm doing the exact same thing but with different shapes. So I started off in neutral grey, and I just very quickly scribbled in some texture highlights all over. I did make an effort to try and make sure I caught all the edges. But then I've gone to ice yellow. Now I'm using ice yellow as a highlight because that kind of matches the highlights on the gold on the armor. Now it's not something you need to do all the time, but sometimes it can just help tie parts of the model together. It helps, it suggests that the light color on the model is all going to be the same. However, I do paint the head and the shoulder, the blue shoulders, without ice yellow, so kind of like I've broken my own idea there. But if you want to keep lighting the color of the light, or kind of like the temperature of the light, consistent throughout the model, it does help if you can get like the color of the lighting matching up. So in this case, it's just a very small amount of yellow. Now there's definitely no yellow on the shoulder pads, but on the skin on the head, there is a certain amount of yellow color involved. So even though it's not ice yellow that I'm using, it's still in there. So the only area that I've failed on really is on the blue shoulder pads. But my only concern with adding ice yellow on the highlights on that is because it'll be yellow mixing in with the blue, and it will send it a little bit green. So I was trying to avoid that. But anyway, regardless, so you can see I'm using the ice yellow. You will probably notice straight away, actually, when you start applying that ice yellow on top of the neutral grey, is that because it's a grey colour underneath, and to start with for the ice yellow, it's quite translucent. It actually almost, you can't really see that much of the yellow. It's only as you layer it up a bit that any of the yellow colour will come through. If you look to the highlight placement again, so the top two completely solid areas, they're almost covered. Now they're not completely opaque, so there is you can see a little bit of sort of sketchiness to them, and that helps to tie it in with the rest of the little plates, because I've done them all sketchy. But then as I go further down, I just focus the highlights on the very top part, and then you just catch the odd lower edge. It kind of suggests that light is glinting off of them. And again, the really nice thing about this kind of painting is you don't have to do that much painting, because the areas that you've left less finished, shall we say, they suggest that they're in shadow, and it's only the kind of like these brighter areas that you don't have to really spend any time on. And even then, because I want these sort of textured looks, it's very, very quick. So it is a nice effect. And it, like I said, because it's so much quicker, I just find it fun. You get to the fun painting stage much more rapidly. And there you go. You see, it's already done. Very small amount of work on it, and it works really nicely as a highlight as well. So now I'm going to do the same thing on the shield. The shield has some sort of interesting shapes and textures on. So I was debating about whether it's worth showing you this on the shield or not. I'm going to try and do it quite quickly. The main thing I want to show you is how to paint the head. So, the beginning of the video is kind of like you just getting through the rest of the model. But as I said, on the shield, it has these sort of, I guess they're like dents, and then there's cracks all over it and things. So it's it creates a few challenges, I guess. A bit more interesting to paint, and also because it's sort of face on, you might wonder where to put the highlights on it. Now I'm placing them so it's going to match the highlights on the gold part of the shield. That's the most important part. So kind of like in the top area, the sort of brighter area, that's where all the main bright highlights are going to go. But you still want to kind of pick out all the detail that's sculpted on there. Obviously, when I first painted it, because you saw in the first video how I airbrushed over it with the, I think it was the XV88 and the Mournfang brown. And that covered all the darker areas. So you obviously have to paint it black before you start this stage. And you're just using exactly the same colours as I just used on the groin area. So it's neutral grey and ice yellow and white. And also have the black paint on the wet palette for when you are likely to make a mistake. But again, this part of the shield, it doesn't stand out too much, and if anything, you can leave it quite dark because the gold should be the main thing that catches the eye anyway. Now, all of the sort of indentations, I've painted like the lower edge around about 2/3 of the way down, and then left the very upper part of each indentation darker. And I've used a scratchy technique again because, as I mentioned, it works sort of like stippling in that as you leave areas a bit further apart, it looks like sort of a shading, a transition area. As I've got further down the shield towards the bottom, I've used less and less of that, and I've just kind of like picked out roughly, the sort of raised areas, just so that you're catching a lot of the detail, because the temptation is always in these things to just leave it blank and unpainted, but it's always very clear on these things that it looks unpainted when you hold it in the hand. I think sometimes it works fine in photographs, for painting things for social media and stuff like that, where you can leave something black and it works like it's in shadow. But if you see these things in the hand, it just clearly looks like it's not painted. So I do think it's worth spending a little bit of time in the shadowed areas, painting details in, even if they're not super clean and not really bright, but just so that to show that you've actually considered the area and you know that it's supposed to be dark but still have some detail in there. I think it's fairly obvious what I'm doing again now, so I'm just selecting a few areas now to push the highlights more, so it suggests that light's catching these a little bit stronger. There are cracks all over the shield. In the artwork, it has kind of lightning coming out from these. I was sort of tempted to do that on this, but the only thing was it was blue lightning, and if I did it as blue lightning, the brightness of the lightning sort of fights against the non-metallic element a little bit, because you're using white as the bright strong highlight, and then you're using white as the bright strong highlight for the non-metallic gold. So they're fighting each other, and it sort of risks making it look a bit duller, because the more sort of white that you paint onto the model, it kind of lessens the effect of the brightness of the white. Whereas if you have a very dark model with a few spots of strong white on there, those become super high contrast and stand out a lot. So it's just a case of working with contrast. So I didn't really want to go that way. Whereas if you look at the artwork, when they use the highlights, the lighting, in the lightning areas and the cracks, the whole sort of atmosphere of the piece is very dark, and there aren't that many white highlights overall. In the first video I mentioned, they tend to just go up to yellow pretty much in a lot of the non-metallic elements. But whereas I've gone up to white, or at least ice yellow, and most of the highlights, as I said, it is going to clash with any white lightning. The other option I was going to do was red, sort of red glows coming from these cracks, but again, well, no, not again. It wasn't going to clash with anything, but it was To be honest, I just didn't want to do it. But it might be interesting. And, you know, I've got a couple more of these models that I'm thinking of painting. I'm going to do a true metallic one as well, because people always ask about true metals. Seems to be sort of factions that build up between non-metallic and true metallic for painting models. I don't really understand. I personally prefer to paint non-metallics. I just find it a bit more fun. I don't really like working with the metallic flakes in true metals. Tend to find you have to have separate water pots and things, and the flakes always get everywhere. But I do actually prefer using them on Adeptus Titanicus models. So, you know, it's not like I'm completely against using true metals or anything like that. I just prefer using non-metallic metal for painting, just because it's more like a sort of a 2D painting effect, and that's sort of my background, is where I come from in regards to painting. So, you know, but there shouldn't really be this kind of these factions building up about, oh, non-metallic metal's trash, or, you know, you only paint non-metallic metals because you want to show off, or, oh, true metal, it's only for people that can't paint, or, you know, all those sort of things. Anyone that says these kind of things, just ignore them. It's nonsense. Of course, I may have said some of these things in the past, but I would have been joking. Like, I know Andy Wardle sometimes says makes fun of true metals, but he uses them all the time as well. So, you know, it's we're just kind of messing around with things like that. So you saw me finish off the shield there. I think it was pretty self-explanatory. I didn't need to explain any more about what was going on. And I painted the hammer the same way. So, you know, sort of scratchy technique, picking out the highlights, going through the stages. I mean, it's very similar to how I painted the armor as well. So I skipped it out. But if you do have any questions, like if there's any parts of this that I've skipped too far ahead on, you know, just ask the questions in the comments below, and I'll see if I can do my best to answer them. I'm just quickly showing you how to paint the leather strap here. I didn't think it was worth spending too much time on this. They're very small parts of the model. You could almost leave them black. You know, they're such small elements. But just to explain what I'm doing, so obviously the area was black to start with. Then I've used Mournfang brown very quickly over the top. Then and you don't so when you apply that, you don't want it to completely cover the area. You leave some sections, some of the black showing through a little bit, especially towards the top section of the belt. So you get a bit of a transition, so where it's darker at the top edge and it goes down to lighter at the bottom. Then pick out any other, like the holes and things like that. Then I've gone to Cadian Fleshtone, and I've just put these kind of scratchy marks. It's actually, again, very similar to how you paint the armour. Kind of get the scratchy marks coming from the edges inwards. And also pick out the top edges of things so they stand out a bit. It gives it a bit of definition. And there you can see like the little scratchy marks I'm putting on the edges. They don't have to be super clean. Try not to make anything look like a pattern is the main thing I'd say. So don't have all the lines parallel. Kind of like have them crisscrossing a little bit sometimes. Don't do crisscrossing all the time. Whatever you do, just don't paint little crosses everywhere. I see this a lot for all types of weathering. And it looks terrible, all these little crosses. It's so unnatural. You don't see crosses on weathering generally if you look at like a rusty surface or scratched surfaces and things. I don't know where this idea of painting little crosses on things came from. I sometimes call them kisses, like you know, people send text messages or whatever to your wife or girlfriend or partner, and you put little kisses at the end, little crosses. And that's all that I see every time that I see all these little marks everywhere. For the fun stage on the leather, I'm using some Ushabti bone. Again, same process as the Cadian Fleshtone, but just picking out a few smaller areas just to punch the highlight. If you find that it looks a bit pale, you want to get some more warmth back in there, use some Mournfang brown, turn it into a glaze, like you saw me do for the Uriel yellow in the previous video, and just glaze over the top of it, and it'll kind of give it a bit more strength of colour back. The only thing is, I'd say just be a bit careful, because you will be getting closer to the colour of the armour then, and it will sort of blend in and it'll look like you've got a non-metallic metal gold belt. So now I'm very quickly going to show you how to do this gem on the chest. I didn't spend too long on this at all, and I just wanted this to match the sort of highlighting for the armour. So I'm just painting it Mephiston red over black. Let it dry first, because if you don't, you're going to end up with a pink highlight. You can see on the wet palette where, so there's gems on the hammer and on the shield, so I'd already done those prior to recording this bit. And I didn't clean off the red, so it leaves the ice yellow looking a little bit pink there. But all I've done is gone onto the ice yellow, picking one facet out, painting it as a highlight. You might be like, oh, why are you picking that facet out? When you hold it under the lamp, the light in front of you, that was the facet that stood out the most. Then I just pick out the cross sections, and so you've got a little bit of definition for the other facets. If you want to make this a little bit more interesting, you could use a lighter shade of red, say Evil Sun and Scarlet, something like that, and paint the bottom left facet in that colour, and that'll look like the light shining through the gem and making the bottom part glow a bit red, catching the inside the gem, if you like. But I wasn't bothered to do that for this, spend that long on it. So now this is going to be the main part of the video on how to paint his head. Now I wanted to paint the head like a black skin type effect, but because of the scarring and things on it, it became a little bit tricky, because you didn't have much in the way of large surface area to work with, and to make these scars stand out, you have to highlight them, or kind of like over highlight them a bit, because of the scale of the piece. Now if this is a larger scale piece, so like a 90mm, you don't have to worry too much about that. You have the space to add the subtleties and things that you would normally find on skin. But when you shrink the model down to I think this is 32mm, or really, really heroic 28, I guess, I don't know, you have to kind of sacrifice some of the subtleties a little bit, just so that you can see them clearly, especially for something if you're going to use it as more of like a tabletop piece. And I know this is kind of a hybrid between display and tabletop, because as I mentioned, it takes a little bit longer than you probably would want to spend on a tabletop piece, but again, it might be something you want to do for the commander elements in your army. So the skin has some compromises on it for what I would actually want to do, but I still spend a little bit of time on it to try and get some interesting colours and things in there. What was helpful for this is, so obviously the skin, and I'm just telling you all this while I'm just painting the non-metallic gold on the around the face. That will help with sorting out the highlights and shadows, so you've got something to work from, because this will, with that already completed, you know how high to take highlights, or how deep the shadows can be, things like that. It just helps with balancing everything. So as I was saying, one of the helpful things was having the head on the model when I did the airbrushing at the beginning in the first video. So this had XV88 airbrushed over the top of it from the top down, which was to help with the speed of getting the non-metallic metal effect done. But because the head was there, so the skin has already been given this like very light dusting of XV88, so it's got sort of like a very kind of warm brown effect on it. Now if you didn't airbrush it, that's fine as well. You could just give it like a coat of Rhinox hide at this stage, but it's just helped sort of pick out some of the highlight areas and things, and again it sort of will help to speed up the process. These little edge highlights are quite handy that I'm painting on at the moment, because they will help to define the shape of the face and separate out the gold from the face as well. I am going to be trying to make the face quite a different colour from the non-metallic gold, so I will push colours perhaps a little more than I otherwise would, but I don't want the strong yellows to be anywhere near that strong on the skin itself, so the skin stands out as a separate surface and a separate colour. But I mean, I'm spending a little bit more time on this part of the model. Like, it's always worth spending more time on the head of the model anyway. It's the part that people are always going to look at first. Now, that's it, unless you've put something really eye-catching on there, like, you know, some really fancy freehand or whatever. Then, you know, if you do that, then that's the first thing that people will look at. But otherwise, if it's like a humanoid figure, people will always look at the face first, just because that's what they're really used to, just for understanding what the piece is. And so really spending just that little bit of extra time, even for you know, standard tabletop troops, if you're going to spend time on one part of the model, make sure it's on the head, because it can also give a better impression of the whole model. So if you've got like a really nicely painted head and the rest of the model is just trash, people could still think that the whole model is painted really well, because they've only just looked at the head really, and they tend to miss details or just ignore faults and things that are on sort of uninteresting parts of the models, like lower legs, you know, kind of more recessed parts that, you know, no one really cares about those, especially people that aren't that into hobby painting anyway. Like, if you show your relatives or something who are into wargaming a model that you've painted, they're going to pick out things that you were completely not expecting, what they think looks good. But the one thing they will do is look at the face on the model. So there as well, you can see the little bounce highlight that I put next to the shine on the trim. So I did go over this on the previous video as well for painting those in. But on this one, you can see more clearly that I haven't taken the highlight anywhere near as bright as the trim section. So that's gone up to white. And then I've only gone up to Zemesi Desert on the bounce highlight. So that helps to add some of the colour onto the non-metallic gold as well. So now I'm going straight onto the face, starting with Cadian Fleshtone. Now, all of the actual colour that I'm using for this is not that important. It's more of a case of just blocking in some highlight points, because I'm going to be glazing over parts of the face later on anyway, and so all the colours can be changed and altered as I see fit, but this just allows me to get kind of blocks of highlight on there to work from. So, and again, it's the same process where you can hold it under a lamp or whatever. You can take a photo of that if you want, so you can always refer back to it and it won't have moved. Whereas if you hold it in your hand, you always run the risk of getting the angle slightly differently from what you originally started at. But, you know, I don't find it that necessary really. You can roughly remember what you've done, so it's not that big of an issue. But yeah, hold it under a lamp just so that you can get some highlight points. I tend to prefer having the light coming from the top left. So usually what that means is when I paint faces, there will be a lot stronger light on the left hand side of the face, and the right hand side of the face is quite often in shadow. The nice thing about that is, though, is that you can work with the shapes a little bit more and high contrast and things, so you can make really nice bright highlights on the left hand side, whereas you don't have the dark recesses. And one thing about, if you're painting pale skin in particular, if you've got a strong light source on one side of the face, people quite often make the mistake of still leaving the recesses dark. Now, I talked about this in the previous video about not leaving the recesses dark if it's in line with the light source. But if you have a strong light coming from the left hand side, it's going to wash out a lot of the darker areas. So you're kind of like working from a lighter mid-tone, and it's only like very minor shadows that you'll get on the left hand side, whereas on the right hand side you have very dark strong shadows, but you can still have some light coming through catching it, so then you get like the super high contrast. I think it looks a little bit more dramatic, but it does mean that depending on which angle you look at the face, you get a very different effect. So for the lip, just to add a bit of colour to it, I had the Cadian Fleshtone on the brush. I dipped it into the Mephiston red that I got left over from painting the gemstones, and that then mixes on the brush as I apply it to the model. So you get kind of like a stronger pink on the lip, but then I can then go back with the Cadian Fleshtone over the top if I find it's a bit too pink, because you don't want it to look like he's wearing lipstick. So, I mean, you might want him to look like he's wearing lipstick, but, that doesn't matter. But in this case, I don't want it to look like he's wearing lipstick. So I can then go over the top of that, and then the translucency of the paint will allow some of the red to still show through, but I can dull it down and desaturate it. So one of the areas on this head in particular that I was struggling with were the cheeks. The cheeks are a little bit strange. Like, normally I'd expect them to be a little bit sort of rounder, but they've almost got sort of recesses in the middle. It's much more obvious on the right hand side. I say right hand side as we look at it, not his right. So it's sort of like a deep recess under the sort of eye socket, and whereas I expect sort of the flesh on the cheek, especially because he doesn't have a scar on this side. If anything, on the left hand side where the scar goes through it, he has sort of a plumper rounder cheek than on the right hand side, which has this recess on. You'll see right at the end of the video where I give a clearer shot between the two sides. If you notice the marks that I'm doing, I'm again doing the sort of stipply scratchy technique, but this is on a much sort of smaller scale, so I'm refining it down. It becomes more like stippling in this case, which I think is sort of interesting because it kind of is suggesting that the pores on the skin. He's obviously quite a seasoned warrior. He's a bit beat up. He's got that big scar on him anyway, so I think having slightly rougher skin texture suits him more. And it's again just a case of layering up. Make sure that your paint is watered down quite well, and you're only applying very small amounts. So I'm using a size 00 Artist Opus brush. I just use that for most of the painting on the smaller scale pieces I do. And it's a fairly new brush, so the point's pretty good on it. One thing that I end up doing on this is I pick out some of the lower edges. So you can see there I picked out the lower cheekbone on the right hand side. Now, I don't really like doing things like that. I also end up painting the lower eyebrow on that side as well, on the darker side, because just so you can see the details. The problem with the darker skin on this scale is that you don't get the strong such strong contrast, and it means some of the details can get a bit lost, it can be frustrating on this side. So you tend to over highlight things. Now again, if you're painting a larger scale piece, that's not so much of a problem, but on these smaller scale pieces, it just is something to be aware of. When you're trying to paint a darker skin tone. You can see I'm painting in the eyes. Now, for some odd reason, it seemed to me like one eye was bigger than the other, and so I put a bit more paint on the right hand side, but the face does not seem very symmetrical to me, really, for the shape of the cheeks and things. So not a big issue, as I said, because it's got the scar going through on the left hand side. But I do find when I'm painting in eyes that I like to be able to kind of almost put too much paint into the eye socket, so then I can sort of shrink it down a little bit afterwards. But it just gives you a bit of space to paint in the iris afterwards. I painted in the whites of the eyes using Blue Horror. I don't really suggest using white paint for painting in the whites of the eyes. It makes it too bright. If you want to put then a white highlight dot afterwards, it means that the white dot will stand out as a proper shine, whereas if you've painted the white of the eyes as pure white, when you put the white dot in it, it doesn't have the same effect. It doesn't stand out as much. And also, like, if you paint the eyes white, they're just so bright, it looks a little bit weird. An off-white is pretty much always going to be better, unless you want it to make it look like the eyes are glowing. I think some of the Stormcast actually do have white glowing eyes anyway. Now, so if you wanted to do that, then I would do them as OSL effect and have like blue glowing coming out from the eyes. If you check out the Imperial Fist video that I posted recently, I mean, it's a Space Marine helmet, so it's not his face with his eyes that are glowing, but the eyes and the helmet, I've done those as OSL glowing, and so you could do the same sort of effect on this. And in fact, because this model does come with a head option, so if you don't want the bare skin, you can have a helmet as well, then you could do those as OSL eyes. So now I'm going to add a bit of colour to the skin, because the Cadian Fleshtone, because of how thin I've applied it, it actually looks very pale. If you keep layering up, it'll actually get darker. It's a bit weird how it works. but if you look on the wet palette there, the Cadian Fleshtone is sort of got quite a dark pinky colour, with a bit of warmth to it, but it's still fairly dark. Whereas when you first apply it, because you're painting with such translucent paint, with very thin layers, you just basically all you're seeing is the high contrast, so how much lighter it is than the dark brown underneath it. So you don't really get to see the colour, but as it would become more opaque, the colour would become more obvious, and then you would see that sort of pinkyish colour. But I want like a sort of a more warm colour, so I'm using Mournfang brown. That's right next to the Cadian Fleshtone, so kind of like bottom middle. You do need that very watered down. It's sort of like a very thick glaze, so I don't know, 3 or 4 parts water to 1 part paint. Mournfang brown's really good in that regard anyway, because it is a very translucent paint. But even then, when you apply it, you still want to stick to that stippling effect. Don't go over the very brightest highlights, but you can kind of like go over the midtones, and it will add that sort of warm colour to the piece. And then I'm going up to Ushabti bone for some of the bright highlights. Now you have to be really careful with this, because there's super high contrast against the darker skin, especially in the more shadowed areas. But this is just to pick out the details. So remember when I said you're over highlighting parts, you can always again knock these parts back down if you take the highlights too high, but it just means that all these details will now stand out on the tabletop. If you are painting for display, that's not such a big issue, because people will look really closely, so you can kind of spend a bit more time on making things look subtle. But if you're painting things to look good from, I don't know, arm's length, we'll say, you do tend to need the higher contrast for things to be like more clear, more visible. I've also got some Rhinox hide on there as well. So Rhinox hide actually is darker than the base skin tone that I started with, because when I airbrushed the XV88 over the top, that made it like a sort of a slightly warmish light brown, whereas the Rhinox hide is a good bit darker. So you can use this as a glaze as well. In fact, all of these colours can be turned into glazes. If you just take a small amount of the colour, put it in your well palette, or even you can just use it on your wet palette really, but just add a load of water to it. You can kind of soften down colours, and you can change the colour, and that, again, knock back the highlights if you find that you've taken the highlights way too high. But so just to talk about the over highlighting thing. The over highlighting allows you to pick out all the details. I talked earlier about how the temptation is to leave very dark areas unpainted, and how that's not a good idea. But what you can do is over highlight areas, so you paint them as brighter than they should be, and then you glaze it back down afterwards, and especially for the face, because it's a focal point and you really want to show that you've painted the details on that, you can glaze these areas back, and after you've over highlighted them, and then but the details are still kind of visible, and you can leave the brightest highlights. So if you see on the forehead there where I went up to a Ushabti bone, I've left the very central dot sort of white, well, Ushabti bone coloured, and then the areas up to it where I've taken the Mournfang brown quite close to it, just to sort of darken down the highlights a little bit. And again, it's that stippling technique all the time, to sort of suggest the skin texture. So he doesn't have super smooth skin. He's a little bit weather beaten, and definitely seen some action. And then for the scar, just picking out the edges. Now, I do find that the scar is quite extreme for the sort of the width of it. If you kind of saw this, like if this is like a realistic scale scar, we're looking at probably, I don't know, like an inch wide and an inch deep or something. It looks like a huge scar on the face for how bright it is. One thing that you could do though is, because of how large the scar is, you could paint inside it. So I'm guessing it's not a brand new wound, so it's not got blood pouring down his face, but you could just paint it like a little bit sort of pinky already inside to show that it's a bit raw, or something like that anyway. And probably really thinking about it now, I probably should have gone back and done that, but you know, that's the case. It's always easier to pick out things in hindsight when you're looking at the videos that you've done. But that's also one sort of little tip that I like to, you know, take photos of things, put it on Instagram, so I can spend time looking at the model for this piece, because you know, it was quite short notice that we from when we received the box to getting it painted, so I had to rush a little bit. So, you know, I've cut corners. Like I said, the back of the model isn't quite finished. I've got, you know, bits and pieces that I'll do a bit more neatly, all kinds of things. And this is just one of those. You know, if I'd spent a bit more time on it after thinking about it, I would paint the inside of the scar just to make it stand out a bit nicer. Then just a little highlight blob on these lips so that they look a bit shiny. I've probably overdone it a bit actually, but it's just taken some of that pink away. Probably could have been a bit neater as well, to be honest. Just go back with the Rhinox hide just to try and neaten it up a little bit. What you will find usually if you do make mistakes like that is that sometimes it's not even worth being super neat to begin with, because you can actually make things look better cutting back in with the paint to get a very clean edge. You know, you get a very fine finish on it. So here I'm just working on the cheek a little bit more, just because what's happened is with the way that it's sculpted, the top edge of the cheek seems like the brightest part, whereas normally with the cheek, like, you would paint the light volume on sort of the midway or like a third down, so that it shows the curve, the shape of the curve, whereas on this guy the cheek seems quite flat and then it's got a hard edge under the eyes, so you kind of like have to fight against the shape a little bit. And then on the other side, you can kind of see again, there's a sort of recess that I was talking about between the top of the eye socket area and the bottom of the cheek. Now, if you wanted to at this stage, if you found that the colour you still want like a sort of a warmer colour to the highlights and things, just go with the Mournfang brown and just push onto it. Again, you want very, very thin paint. If anything, you could even take it to a complete glaze now, like 6 or 7 parts water to 1 part paint, and just sort of, you know, glaze over it a little bit. So here's the finished model with the head stuck in now. I think it looks quite cool. As I said, it probably takes a little bit too long as a tabletop piece for this kind of painting, but you know, it is what it is. I'm fairly happy with the piece anyway. So that's the end of this video. I hope you enjoyed it. I apologise it had to be in 2 parts, but it really was like I ended up having a lot of video recorded. If you are interested in pushing your painting a little bit further, I do have a Patreon and a personal website where I take the painting like to a slightly higher standard, so you can do things like look for to improve your painting for things like Gold Demon and stuff like that. But apart from that, please subscribe to the YouTube channel. There's going to be plenty more videos to come still. And as I said, that's the end of the video. And thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.